Hello and welcome to another one of Mr. Deeping's science lessons. For today's session you're going to need a book and a pen, and in your books I'd like to get down today's title, which is Biotechnology. For today's starter activity we're going to be looking at how yeast is used to make bread, and I want to know, how does the anaerobic respiration of yeast result in a fluffy loaf of bread? So think back to the equation for anaerobic respiration. What is produced as a result of this process, and which one of those products is going to result in this fluffiness? I'm going to put 5 seconds on the clock, and if you need more time, pause the video, and when you're finished we'll go through the answers together. Have you related your anaerobic respiration to this fluffy loaf of bread? Anaerobic respiration in yeast produces ethanol and carbon dioxide. The reason why there's so many air bubbles in this loaf of bread is because of the carbon dioxide produced by the yeast. There's also another reason why this loaf of bread is so fluffy, and we're going to look at that a little later in the lesson. In today's lesson we're going to explain how yeast can be utilized to make bread, how yeast can be used to make beer and wine, and also how the products of anaerobic respiration benefit these two processes. In your books, get down the subheading Making Bread. Now, when we make bread and we make our bread dough, we add yeast. This yeast converts the sugars in the dough into ethanol and carbon dioxide. Because remember, our anaerobic respiration in yeast and in some plants is glucose as our reactant, and that produces ethanol and carbon dioxide, a process which also releases energy. But when we have bread, it's not full of ethanol, so where does this ethanol go? Well, when we put our dough in the oven to bake, ethanol boils. It changes state from a liquid to a gas. And so this causes more bubbles to form within the bread. And with that in mind, I want you to describe the difference in appearance you would expect to see between a bread baked with yeast and a bread baked without yeast. And if you really want a challenge, can you give any examples of breads which are baked without yeast? I'm going to put 5 seconds on the clock, and if you need more time, pause the video, and when you're finished, we'll go through the answers together. You got some answers? Let's have a look at our bread without yeast. The dough will not rise because there's going to be no CO2 or ethanol produced because there is no anaerobic respiration. This is going to result in a flatter bread. But to fully describe the difference, we need to also make reference to our bread with yeast. In this case, the dough would rise because CO2 and ethanol are produced. Because that yeast is there, that anaerobic respiration is occurring. This is going to result in a larger loaf of bread. Examples of breads baked without yeast are the flatbread, but often when we bake bread without yeast, we will find a substitute for the yeast to enable our bread to rise. Like when you add soda into your soda bread. So now we've explained how yeast can be utilized to make bread. Next we're going to explain how yeast can be used to make beer and wine. In your books I would like to get down the subheading Fermentation. And this fermentation also utilizes our anaerobic respiration in yeast, where it takes our reactant glucose and it produces carbon dioxide and ethanol. In the process of making the bread, both of these products were useful, but in the fermentation, our CO2 is a waste product. We're only interested in the production of ethanol. But where does this glucose come from in order to get this fermentation going? The glucose in wine comes from the sugar in the grapes. The glucose in beers comes from the sugar in the barley. And yeast is favoured for these reactions because it contains enzymes that act as a catalyst, so the rate of reaction is going to be quicker. Also, because these mixtures are nutrient rich, because there's a lot of glucose, the yeast are going to divide to produce more yeast, which is again going to cause the rate of reaction to increase. Now this fermentation must be carried out in the absence of oxygen, because this ethanol reacts with the oxygen that's in the atmosphere to produce ethanoic acid. Ethanoic acid being the scientific name for vinegar. Now we're going to have a look at how much ethanol we can produce with 180 grams of glucose. This results in 88 grams of carbon dioxide being produced, but how much ethanol does that yield? Well, if we look at the mass of everything on the left side of the arrow, we've got 180 grams. On the right of the arrow, we've currently got 88 grams. Now the mass of everything on the left side of the arrow has to equal the mass of everything on the right side of the arrow. So if everything on the left equals 180 grams, and so far we've got 88 grams on the right, how much have we got to add to 88 grams to get to 180? 92 grams plus 88 grams will give us 180 grams. Now, with that in mind, we're going to have a go at this task. A beer maker uses barley with a total of 90 grams of glucose. What is the mass of the ethanol produced? Also, we have a winemaker which uses grapes with a total of 270 grams of glucose. What is the mass of ethanol they will produce? And if you really want a challenge, can you calculate the amount of carbon dioxide produced in each reaction? And if you want a super challenge, each of these people are going to produce 1 kilogram of wine or beer. Can you calculate the percentage alcohol by volume in each? A bit of a hint to get you started. This 90 grams is half of 180 grams. So what's going to happen to the amount of carbon dioxide and ethanol produced? I'm going to put 5 seconds on the clock, and if you need more time, pause the video, and when you're finished, we'll go through the answers together. Have you finished your calculations? If we have 90 grams of glucose, that is half of our 180 grams. Therefore, the amount of ethanol must also be half. If 180 grams of glucose produces 92 grams of ethanol, then 90 grams of glucose is going to produce half of 92. 92 divided by 2 is 46 grams of ethanol. If you had a go at the challenge, this also means that the amount of carbon dioxide is going to be halved. So you'd make 44 grams of carbon dioxide. And that 46 grams of ethanol and that 44 grams of carbon dioxide will equal the 90 grams of glucose that we started with on the left side of our reaction. So let's have a look at our winemaker who has 270 grams of glucose. And there's 2 ways you can do this. Number 1, you can take the amount of ethanol produced in our first equation, which used 180 grams. Then you would add the amount of ethanol produced in our first question, which had 90 grams of glucose. Because if you take 180 plus 90, you get up to 270 grams. If we have 180 grams of glucose, we get 92 grams of ethanol. If we have 90 grams of glucose, we end up with 46 grams of ethanol. 92 grams plus 46 grams gives us 138 grams of ethanol produced. Another way you might have done this, you can see that 270 grams is 1.5 times bigger than 180. So you could take this 92 grams of ethanol produced in our original reaction and multiply it by 1.5, which will also give you 138 grams. This will also work when you are calculating the amount of carbon dioxide. If you have 88 grams and you multiply it by 1.5, that will give you 132 grams of carbon dioxide produced. Did you have a go at this super challenge, calculating the alcohol by volume for both our beer and our wine? If you did, I would like to hear your answers down in the comments below. So now we can explain how yeast can be used to make beer or wine. In your books, I'd like to get down another subheading, carbon neutral fuel, because now that we know a couple of equations relating to anaerobic respiration and biotechnologies, we can begin to explain why ethanol might be a more favourable fuel over fossil fuels, starting with our photosynthesis. That takes 6 molecules of carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. It reacts those with 6 molecules of water. This produces a molecule of glucose and 6 molecules of oxygen. So now our plants have produced this glucose. Now that we've got glucose, we can begin our fermentation. We take our glucose, we add our yeast, and this converts the glucose into 2 molecules of carbon dioxide and 2 molecules of ethanol. But what can we do with this ethanol? Well, we can use it in a combustion reaction to release its energy. So if you take 1 molecule of ethanol and you burn it in the presence of oxygen, this is going to produce 2 molecules of carbon dioxide and 3 molecules of water. But our fermentation didn't just produce one molecule of ethanol, it produced 2 molecules of ethanol. And because we're doubling the amount of ethanol, that means we're going to need to double the amount of oxygen it's going to react with, and it's going to produce double the amount of carbon dioxide and double the amount of water. So our 2 molecules of ethanol react with 6 molecules of oxygen to produce 4 molecules of carbon dioxide and 6 molecules of water. Now there is a lot going on here, but the important bits are, during this photosynthesis reaction, 6 molecules of carbon dioxide are removed from the atmosphere. When the glucose undergoes the fermentation, 2 molecules of carbon dioxide are released back into the atmosphere. And when we combust those 2 molecules of ethanol, we then release another 4 molecules of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Now let's look at that a bit more simply. So our photosynthesis removes 6 molecules of carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, and our fermentation and combustion collectively release 6 molecules of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And this is what we mean by a carbon neutral fuel. Our CO2 emissions are equal to the CO2 which was required to produce the fuel. This means that we are not increasing the amounts of greenhouse gases which are in the atmosphere and not contributing further to climate change. For our next task, I would like you to describe how atmospheric carbon dioxide becomes ethanol for the use in cars, and there's 2 processes to get it from the CO2 in the atmosphere into ethanol. And I want you to explain what is meant by carbon neutral fuels. And if you really want a challenge, I would also like to suggest some of the disadvantages of using biofuels such as ethanol. I'm going to put 5 seconds on the clock, and if you need more time, pause the video, and when you're finished, we'll go through the answers together. So let's have a look at how atmospheric carbon dioxide becomes ethanol. That atmospheric carbon dioxide is going to react with water to form glucose in a process called photosynthesis. This glucose is then fermented in the presence of yeast to produce ethanol and carbon dioxide. What is meant by a carbon neutral fuel? It means that the amount of carbon dioxide which is given off during the production and the combustion of the fuel is equal to the amount of carbon dioxide which was taken in from the atmosphere during photosynthesis. Now there are some disadvantages of using these biofuels. First of all, you need a large quantity of sugar-rich foods. If these foods are being used for the production of fuel, then this is food which isn't being delivered to people. Another disadvantage is that the ethanol does not release as much energy when you combust it as fossil fuels do. So the same mass of ethanol will release less energy than the same mass of petrol. So now we can see how the products of anaerobic respiration benefit these 2 processes and can be used for the production of carbon neutral fuels. Which means we've only got one more thing I'd like to do, which is our plenary, and I've got 3 questions for you. Why does bread not contain alcohol? Why does wine usually contain more alcohol than beer? And I would also like to suggest what sorts of plants could be used for the production of ethanol. And as a hint there as well, it has to be something which contains a lot of sugar. I'm going to put 5 seconds on the clock, and if you need more time, pause the video, and when you're finished, we'll go through the answers together. So why does the bread not contain ethanol? Well, because when you bake the bread, the ethanol boils. It changes state from a liquid to a gas. So why does wine usually contain more alcohol than beer? It is because the grapes contain more sugar to ferment into ethanol than the barley does for the beer. So suggestions as to what sort of plant could be used for the production of ethanol fuel, it would be any plant which contains a lot of sugar. Plants which contain lots of sugar are those which bear fruit. So any suggestion which has a fruit-bearing plant is a good suggestion. And that brings us to the end of biotechnology. I hope you've had a great lesson, and I'll see you next time. Thanks for watching the lesson. If you found it useful, don't forget to press the like button, and why don't you subscribe and press the bell icon as well so you know when the next lesson's available. You can also support me on Patreon, and you can follow me on Facebook and Twitter, and I appreciate all the support. And I'll see you next time.